for joining us today for the first part of the Infrastructural Inequalities, Resistant Media and Abolition Futures program. My name is Andrew Brooks. I'm a lecturer in the School of Arts and Media at UNSW, a member of the Media Futures Hub and the Infrastructural Inequalities Research Network. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Bejugal people who are the traditional custodians of the land I am on. I want to acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded to the British Crown, that their connection to this land is continuous and unbroken. I want to acknowledge the great and ongoing violence perpetuated in the name of settlement, and I want to acknowledge the daily and ongoing resistances to colonisation, which, as Patrick Wolf put it, is a structure rather than an event. I would like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We're here today to talk about abolitionist futures, and it is worth saying at the outset that to think about abolition in Australia necessarily involves struggles for the abolition of the settler state and its possessive logics of patriarchal white sovereignty, to borrow Eileen Morton Robertson's incisive formulation. The Australian colony is underpinned by a carceral imagination. The national mythos cast settlers as petty criminals and misfits that transformed a frontier outpost into a profitable pastoral economy, all while maintaining a healthy skepticism of British pomposity. But this mythos obscures the violence of invasion and occupation, the misery of the capital relation that produced a surplus convict population, and the emergence of policing, which is always racialised and remains central to the project of the settler state today. Policing, prisons, and the system of criminal punishment are integral infrastructures of colonisation and capitalism that produce and uphold racism. The 474 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody that have occurred since the Royal Commission in 1991 are an indictment of the carceral system and the state it preserves. Against such ongoing violence, there is a long history of abolitionist organising by First Nations people across these lands and in opposition to the illegitimacy of the settler state. We learn from those histories as we continue to work toward a different world. And we learn from ongoing organising too. And we'll be posting some links in the chat today to campaigns that seek the abolition of the carceral state and campaigns that support families affected by organised state violence. Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us that abolition must be green, red, and international. She says abolition has to be green. It has to take seriously the problem of environmental harm, environmental racism, and environmental degradation. To be green, it has to be red. It has to figure out ways to generalise the resources needed for well-being for the most vulnerable people in our community, which will then extend to all people. And to do that, to be green and red, it has to be international. It has to stretch across borders so that we consolidate our strength, our experience, and our vision for a better world. And so with a commitment to internationalism, we also want to express our solidarity with the Palestinian intifada currently unfolding, which seeks the abolition of the settler state and insists on the liberation of Indigenous land. What is abolition a call for, and how does it relate to the question of infrastructure? These questions will underscore today's panel, which involves a group of organisers and thinkers committed to theorising the limits of carceral justice and organising abolitionist futures. This panel is the first of a small public program under the title of Infrastructural Inequalities, Resistant Media and Abolitionist Futures. The second instalment of this program will take place on Monday, May 17 at 10 a.m. That's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we'll focus on resistant and activist media practices, featuring Alison Whitaker, Rocket Bretherton, and Joanna Bell. We'll pop links in the chat to that, but if you're registered for this through Eventbrite, you'll already have the information for Monday's session, and we hope you can join us again. Before I get to introducing a panel of speakers that hardly need introduction, I want to quickly take this opportunity to thank my collaborators, Astrid Larange and Liam Greeley, for their labours in making this event possible. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at UNSW in the Media Futures Hub who have provided ongoing material and intellectual support. These two panels are part of an ongoing research network that convenes under the banner of Infrastructural Inequalities. This network, which brings together researchers, activists, and artists, seeks to interrogate the materials and networks that enable and constrain the distribution of resources, goods, and ideas necessary for living. Infrastructural Inequalities investigates the unjust distribution of resources, amenities, and opportunities, and describes a collaborative inquiry that seeks to intervene in the production and reproduction of existing inequalities. The program builds on an open access journal, Infrastructural Inequalities on Policing, Crisis, and Abolition, that investigates how crisis, policing, and infrastructure are bound to each other. What we might call organised abandonment by the state, the implementation of austerity, the erosion of welfare, the dismantling of public services, goes hand in hand with the expansion of policing and incarceration, which is unevenly deployed along lines of race, class, and gender. We can see many examples of this, including in recent legislation rushed through Parliament this week that allows for the federal government to jail refugees for life, or in the regular and ongoing expansion of policing budgets at the state level. In turn, we ask how an abolitionist approach to infrastructure might move us toward a world in which all of our needs are adequately met. Put another way, the struggle to abolish police is also a struggle to transform economic structures, justice systems, education, healthcare, housing, and so on. Abolition demands revolutionary change and sets about to enact the change in the here and now. Or to borrow the words of one of our panelists, Tabitha Lean, abolition is a verb. We are extremely grateful and very humbled to be joined today by Tabitha Lean, Debbie Kilroy, Behrouz Boochani, Omid Tofighiyan, and Amanda Porter, all of whom are dedicated to critiquing and dismantling the carceral system in its many guises. Each panelist will speak for 10 minutes and we'll then move into a discussion between the panelists, at which point there will also be an opportunity to take questions from those watching the stream. If you have any questions, please use the chat box on the YouTube stream. We'll be watching the chat and can relay questions to our panelists. We'll also be posting links throughout the session into the chat that link to writing and relevant materials produced by our panelists, as well as to abolitionist organisations and materials, and links to groups supporting families of those affected by deaths in custody and state violence. I suspect the panelists assembled here today will be familiar to many of you, and so I will keep the introduction brief and introduce each of the speakers. Now I'll introduce all of the speakers now, so we can move directly from one panelist to the next with minimal interference from myself. Tabitha Lean, or as her ancestors know her, Burin Minyan, is a Gunditjmara woman, an activist and storyteller. She is also a lived experience abolitionist, having spent almost 2 years in prison and 2 years on home detention, and remains tethered to the system on parole, or as she calls it, open air prison. Tabitha is committed to elevating the voices of those with lived prison experience to expose state-sanctioned carceral violence in an effort to stop the brutalising and killing of her own people in the colonial frontier that is the criminal injustice system. Debbie Kilroy was first criminalised at the age of 13 and spent over 2 decades in and out of women and children's prisons. Driven to end the criminalisation and imprisonment of girls and women, Debbie established Sisters Inside, as well as her own law firm, Kilroy and Callaghan Lawyers. An unapologetic abolitionist, Debbie's activism work centres on dismantling the prison industrial complex and all forms of carceral control and exile. With a firm belief that there should be nothing about us without us, Debbie established the National Network of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls to centre the voices, experiences, and aspirations of criminalised and imprisoned women and girls to change the face of justice in this country. Behrouz Boochani is a Kurdish Iranian writer, journalist, scholar, cultural advocate, filmmaker, and former refugee. He was a writer for the Kurdish language magazine Werya. He writes regularly for The Guardian and several other publications. Boochani is also co-director of the 2017 feature-length film Choka, please tell us the time, and the author of No Friend But the Mountains, Writings from Manus Prison. Omid Tofighiyan is a lecturer, researcher, and community advocate, combining philosophy with interests in rhetoric, religion, popular culture, transnationalism, displacement, and discrimination. He has published widely and is the collaborator and translator of Boochani's No Friend But the Mountains, Writing from Manus Prison. And finally, Amanda Porter is an academic activist of Aboriginal, Brinja and settler Greek-English descent. She is currently Senior Fellow in Indigenous Programs at Melbourne Law School, where she researches and teaches on the violence of policing, in particular, deaths in custody, premature deaths, and near misses. Thank you again at the outset to all of our panelists for agreeing to take part today, and I'll hand over to Tabitha Lean.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Well, Nyata, everyone. My name is Tabitha, or as my ancestors know me, Buriminyan. I'm a Gunditjmara woman born and raised on Kaurna Yurta. I'm zooming in today from the lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders and thank the Kaurna people for their ongoing custodianship of this country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge any of the sovereign lands that any of you are joining us from today, and acknowledge fellow Indigenous people, both on the panel and those in the audience. And I specifically want to pay my respects right now to my brothers, sisters, and kin who are currently sitting in cages on their own country, my brothers, sisters, and kin who are currently enduring carceral violence, torture, and for many of our sisters and children, sexual violence sanctioned by the state. It is for them that I raise my lived experience voice. I just want to make a note here to let you know, any Indigenous people in the audience, I will, throughout my presentation, will contain the names of some deceased people. I'm a criminalised Black woman, having spent 2 years in prison, an accumulated 2 years on home detention, and I'm still tethered to the system on parole. I am number 177057. I've made mistakes in my past, and some of them were despicable. My face was splashed across the TV and newspapers, and my life became a magazine anyone could thumb through. And the reason I'm telling you this is not to offer myself up for your judgment, because I am absolutely not doing that, but because I know that most people like their information packaged in these bundles of objectivity, but that's not what today's talk is about, and that's not what I'm about. I've been given 10 minutes to yarn with you today, and many of you know that I'm an abolitionist, a staunch and unwavering and unapologetic abolitionist. But today I want to use my experience to tell you why I'm an abolitionist and why I think abolition is a common sense idea, and why I think abolition is the only way I think any of us blackfellas can survive this colony. When I went to prison, I thought it was the worst day of my life. In fact, I thought it was the end of my life. I mean, going to prison is like descending into the depths of hell. Every person in a blue uniform is like a foot soldier of the devil himself. And in some ways, going to prison was the end of my life, that life, because walking through those prison gates forever altered my dialogical relationship with the state and, frankly, with the broader community. Add to that, I was torn away from my children, my family, and I was taken into Adelaide Women's Prison to sit in a cage. I cried for the entire first 10 months, silently in my cell and silently in the showers, because God forbid you showed any weakness to anyone in that place or any sign of mental distress, because you'd be thrown in a hard cell in solitary. For those long 10 months, I barely left my cell, only to venture out occasionally to play a game of cards with someone who might have smiled back at you when you glanced at them. I mourned my life, my kids, my liberty, and I was scared. I was so scared that when I went to prison and they asked me, "Are you Aboriginal?" at intake, I hesitated. And now that's a really shameful thing for me to admit. And frankly, I think this might be the first time I've actually ever said it to anyone other than my own head. So when they asked me that, I hesitated, I paused, because I mean, I have fair skin, I could pass right. Now I know how much privilege that drips me in, and I feel shame saying it, but I actually for a moment thought I could pass as white, because for me, white skin equals safety in prison. So I said with hesitation and a nervous stutter, "I don't want to tell you." And so with their unsmiling eyes and their scowled mouth and their angry eyebrows, they looked back at me and they looked back at their paperwork, which, by the way, is always in some sort of manila folder, like as if they've had a case file on you for your entire life. And they looked me in the eyes and said, well, the system says you're Aboriginal and you don't want to start your prison life off with a lie. And I paused because all I could hear was this like ringing in my ears and the words prison and life dancing around in my brain, because those two words seemed an oxymoron to me. Life, in prison, life. I say that because for so many of my people and for my community, prison literally sucks the life out of us. It extinguishes life-giving oxygen from our lungs. It consumes our communities, our families, our brothers, sisters, aunties, and uncles. And God, I was scared that day. Not just scared of the prison environment and the people in there. I was scared that I would be killed, not by fellow prisoners, but by the ones in blue shirts. And you know, even today, that fear has not dissipated. I've just learned to live with the fear, learned to live with the constant anxiety, panic, and I exist in this hyper-aware state, constantly scanning for threat. I live with that fear and the ongoing onslaught of sexual violence and abuse at the hands of the state every fortnight that I present at a parole meeting. Every single one of us caught in the carceral net exists in this state of surveillance, hypervigilance, and shame of constantly being seen. So I endured and I survived. I survived those 2 years inside and I got out of prison into home detention. It was tough, but again, I survived. And now I'm on parole and I'm again trying to survive. And I don't even think that I've gotten to the living bit yet, because it seems that the devil's playground exists above ground too, an open air prison with no barbed wire, except that which binds your heart and spirit. But the thing is that with my survival came a responsibility to the mob still sitting in cages, hence my work on abolition. Because the thing about prisons and punishment is that it's relentless. It's why those of us in the system talk about perpetual punishment. It never ends. Just this week, I have been manoeuvred into a position where I've had to resign from a position at a university. This has come about because some people won't ever let you forget who you were in a very small moment of time. Some people want to drag you back to the past and force you to stay there. And that's the thing about perpetual punishment. This is how the system is constructed. In my case, the system has cast me as a savage yet to be tamed. And sadly, some members of the broader community become the vigilante enforcers of this regime. They take on the surveillance of the state and become judge, jury, and executioner because they have internalized this pull to vengeance. And I'm not even sure that they realise that the pull to vengeance is an impulse of the state. They have swallowed the carceral Kool-Aid and become unofficial agents of the state. And mark my words, the carceral state relies on this. But the thing about having a record is that we can't complain. We can't get angry. We have to remain silent, contrite, and quiet. We can't make waves. We can't fight back. We can't even mutter the words, "This isn't fair, you're victimising me." And that's because the system is stacked against us, and it's stacked unfairly against blackfellas, and that is deliberate. It doesn't matter how good I am, how reformed I am, how much effort I put in, how many times I reinvent myself, I will always be a criminal. Maybe one day I'll be an ex-con if I'm lucky. My existence in some spaces will forever be a problem. Now, this isn't me doing a poor woe is me, because I am very aware of my debt to the state and to the community. But I guess I am asking you all in the audience today whether you are happy that this kind of justice is meted out in your name. Because let me tell you that everything that happens to me and continues to happen to me is happening because of you. This system is designed to keep people like you safe from people like me. So I wonder, when do you think my debt to society will be considered paid? When should I be free? When I came out of jail? When I finish parole? Is it in 10 years' time while I'm still rejected from workplaces because I can't get a police clearance? Will it be when I'm 80 and have lived 78 good years to my 2 bad ones? Or is it when I finally die? And die we do. Our people are being killed by this system, whether it's behind bars, in the backs of correctional services vans like Brother Fella Morrison, in police cells like Miss Do, in the streets like too many of our kids, or in our bedrooms like Brother Kumajay Walker. We are killed. We do not die in custody. We are killed. We are killed by the state. We are systematically broken down to a 6-digit number. I know because I am 177057. I am one of this country's disposable people, and every single week I struggle to survive a system designed to kill, dehumanise, and eradicate my kind. And this is why abolition is the only common sense option for me. This is why I argue that abolition might be the only thing that breathes life back into my communities and into the lungs of my people. So abolition for me is crucial and it's urgent. It's so damned urgent. It isn't a catchphrase for me, nor is it a whim or a slogan for a sticker on my laptop or a word on my t-shirt. My people cannot wait for the rest of so-called Australia to see the value in abolishing systems that suck the life from our communities. We can't wait until your social media profiles fill up with black squares or another life is taken on international soils for you to care about the lives of our mob here in this country. We must start to imagine a different kind of justice, a justice free of prisons, policing and surveillance. This is an opportunity to imagine a future free of punishment, imprisonment and exile. And you know, abolition might sound like a radical idea, but my people have been working towards it for decades. In fact, we've been fighting against the enslaving and incarcerating of our people for 233 years. Safety, individual and community safety cannot come without freedom and justice, because who we are and what we are comes from the alchemy of our struggles. If we dismantle systems that cage and punish, we can explicitly fight genocide and dispossession and create a world focused on radical reciprocity and accountability. So if you're banging on about decolonisation in your workplaces, pedagogies, classrooms, policies, organisations and articles, and you are not an abolitionist, well, then you are not decolonising. If you are judging people and exiling them and punishing people, then you are an agent of the carceral state. Because abolition absolutely requires us all to disentangle ourselves from the pull to vengeance, the pull to retribution and revenge, the pull to punishment, the pull to surveillance, and the pull to act like a cop. And yes, that means even the little cop in your head that judges your neighbour or the mother at the supermarket. And for me, abolition is not just about getting rid of cages. It's about actually undoing the parts of society that continue to feed on and maintain the oppression of masses of my people through punishment, violence and control. Because the prison industrial complex isn't an isolated system. So abolition must be a broad strategy. And so I'm interested in building models today that develop and represent how we want to live in the future. I see abolition as a practical organising tool and a long-term goal and a way of living. So I end up this part of my yarn. I just want to issue a call of action. Right now, my friend and my kin, Latoya and her family, are sitting in the Supreme Court of South Australia fighting for answers, truth and justice for their brother Wayne Fella Morrison, who was killed in the backs of a correctional services van at Yatala Labor Prison here on Kaurna land. Not only are they fighting for their brother, but they are fighting for every black person who is in jail, who will go to jail, who has been to jail. So please get behind them, sign their petition to ban the use of spit hoods, and please put your money where your decolonial abolition mouth is and donate to their GoFundMe. Because that family, like all the black families who have had people taken from them by this system, your system, are on the front lines. They are battling a system designed to shield itself and protect its own kind. But they turn up every single damn day, to hear things that no family member should ever have to hear or bear witness to, the grossest acts of conspiracy and silence. So I look at it this way. We have to wage war against the system. And all that is left is to decide which side you're on. And if you want to breathe life back into people, into communities, into this world, if you want to prioritize healing over harm, abundance over scarcity, love over hate, life over death, then roll your sleeves up and get to work. Thank you. Sorry, I think I was supposed to hand over to you, Debbie, or yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes? Sorry. As you may see, I'm a bit houseless at the moment. I'm not at home. I'm not in Meanjin. I, at the moment, am on Woolgaroo, Kabar and Bindal country, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. So as I sit here with Palm Island over my shoulder, who I want to also acknowledge elders past and present, I've been working here with staff at Sisters Inside to actually free an elderly traditional owner from Palm Island who has been incarcerated for a period of time, which is one of the most tragic situations I've come across, and so sad. She has onset dementia, and so police had decided to criminalise her for certain offences because of her onset of dementia, and ended up remanded in custody. Was paraded in front of everybody, all her community, put in handcuffs in the back of a van and flown here to come to the women's prison here. We fought to get her bail. She did get bail, so she's here in this community with the Woolgaroo, Kabar and Bindal community. However, she pines every day to go home because she's not allowed to go home because of her bail conditions. Every day we have her in safe accommodation, which is a few kilometres out of town. Every morning she walks to town to come to Queensland Housing to ask them to send her back home. She doesn't understand what's happening. The lawyers can't move things faster. The police officer on the island has the power to change the bail condition to allow her to go home. We have now only just this morning been able to speak to the Deputy Mayor on Palm Island to get some movement so that she can go home to her country where she's been for over 7 decades. This is the violence. One part of the violence that's inflicted by the state on elderly Aboriginal traditional owners on an island off the coast of this country, where police can criminalise, handcuff, publicly shame, put her in a prison van where we know a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people have died in over the years, and sent to a prison where she has no understanding. And no matter what we try to do, our hands are tied because the police officer on Palm Island has the power to allow her back onto the island or not. We're working with the lawyers right now to actually see if that we can take it back to court. But even the court will take direction from the police, not from us, no matter what evidence we put before it. And the court is part of that structural carceral violence as well. So that's why I'm sitting here outside with my phone blue tacked to a pipe talking to you today. And if the phone falls down, it's because the blue tack has slid off the pipe. So I apologise for that on one level, but I don't on another, because it's important that we free Auntie from all the violence that's been inflicted on her right now, which she's never experienced in her life. And this is the world that we live in. This is what we allow the police state, the prison state, the court state, the actual state to inflict violence against the most harmless people, the most caring people, people that have lived in this country for tens of thousands of years. And this is the actual response that we, as the white colonisers, enact and perpetrate against the first peoples of this country. We need to hang our head in shame, but we also need to lift our head in that shame and take action to dismantle the structures, as Tabitha just spoke about, to dismantle this violence, this structural violence. It is not about individuals. It is about a structure that has been built on and continue to get built on. And as my sister would say, Angela Davis, the prison industrial complex itself is a product of various reforms over time. This country was allegedly the reform for the UK to bring us convicts here. But what we've done, decade after decade, is to try to continue, we continue to colonise and have the impact of ongoing genocide in the context of state violence through policing, the violence of policing, prisons, and through the court system. And I would even add through the coronial inquest system, where that to me is just a butt-covering exercise to cover the state's arse so that lawyers, QCs and all the rest can come and to protect the prison officers and the police officers who have actually killed someone at their hands, and then they have the right to remain silent and say nothing. And Angela talks about that prison itself is a reform, and we can never reform the police. We can never reform prisons. We can never reform courts. The only way that we can dismantle is to burn them down and start again from the ashes. With love, with care, with respect, with dignity, with acknowledgement of the custodians, the rightful custodians of this country. Not us white fellas exerting our power over First Nations people in this country through these violent structures. I was going to talk about Sisters Inside. I think Tabitha's covered wonderfully, beautifully, as you always do, Tab, about abolition and particularly today about your journey. And I can resonate with that as a woman who's been in prison, you know, criminalised as a 13-year-old girl for wagging school, and the violence that was perpetrated against my body and other girls' bodies, and then as women pipelined into the prison system and that ongoing violence. And Sisters Inside came from a very violent situation in the prison. It was where my friend was stabbed to death sitting beside me. And, you know, the prison officers knew that Storm had this, it was like a big barbecue fork, like a roasting fork. They knew that it was stolen from the kitchen. They knew that she had it in her cell, and also a sharpening stone, and that she was sharpening it every night. And they knew that she had it. All you had to do was look through that window in the cell door and you could see it sitting on her table in her cell, and they did nothing. And this was going on for about a week, that she was sharpening that stone every night. And then on Sunday, as Debbie put her head down on the table after we had lunch, and she said, the last thing she said was, "I feel like I could sleep forever." And then she was grabbed from behind, and I was grabbed from behind. And the prison had those plastic molded chairs. I was big enough in the sense to get out of the chair, and the woman ran away. But by that time, Debbie had been stabbed numerous times across her chest into her heart area. And it's only that I could see in that instance that Storm had blacked out in what she was doing, which was stabbing Debbie to death. And so I picked up the chair and hit her across the back. She sort of like came back to her consciousness and ran, and Debbie slumped to the floor. We were both taken to the hospital in separate ambulances, and Debbie was taken to have surgery, and even to the point where the health system, they did not put the side of the bed up, and she fell off the trolley onto the floor. Like, this is how we are treated. Like, you know, I think we've become so desensitized to what actually happens to our bodies, those of us that are criminal in prison, that you are so desensitized. We are so desensitized as a community to think that that's okay, that you let a person, another human being, fall off a hospital bed trolley onto the floor and left there because she's a prisoner. Debbie was picked up, taken into the operating theatre, but died on the table. They were going to operate on me, and I was arcing up because I felt that I was all right. I'd been hit twice, and the fork had hit my ribs and bounced off. And it was only when a prison officer came and I had the drip in my hand, she grabbed my hand so hard that the needle was jamming into my hand, and tears were coming to my eyes because of that pain. But I could see in her eyes that, because she was crying, that I knew Debbie was dead. And she delivered the news to me. And it was then that I demanded to go back to prison. I wasn't allowed until a couple of days later. However, here we were when I was taken back. Storm had been removed, put in the men's prison, which was next door, and I could hear her screaming from the towers in the solitary confined cells in the men's prison. And here we were, women left inside that prison to deal with the murder, to deal with the violence, to deal with what happened. We didn't have a relief valve. Prison officers were allowed to go on stress leave. They left the prison and didn't come back. Some never came back. Some came back 12 months later, some came back 2 years, whatever. We were left to deal with that, to deal with what the most horrific violence I've ever experienced in my life, to deal with that ourselves. And from that, no one was brought in. We had no healing. We had no psychs. We had no social workers. Not that we wanted, I'm just saying. But I mean, you know, now prison is quite a different situation. If someone dies, everybody's running to their side, basically to cover their asses. It's not about the person who's died, or not about the women who are in the cells next door. And I think of my daughter when she was in prison. When the Brisbane Women's Prison first opened in 1999, I told the prison someone is going to die because of the violence, because of the structure of that new prison. And sure enough, one of the women had suicided and died. The women around her in the cells across from her, beside, and my daughter was beside, could see those across that she was hanging, and they left her there. They came, looked in that window once again, and left her body hanging there to go and get others before they opened the door, because they believed that there was danger in the cell. They cut her down, they dragged her body out, and my daughter lives with that vision as well. I know I probably got 1 minute. I was going to talk about System Side being an abolitionist organisation, but because of that violence, I will just say, the violence that I've experienced, the violence that Tabitha's experienced, the violence that all the women that I know that are in prison today experience, and tomorrow and the next day, that is why we are abolitionists. We must do everything we possibly can to decarcerate, and decarcerate is the journey. Abolition is the destiny, and we do so. And just an example, in the last 15 days, we've had over 50 women released, whether that's from the watch house, out on bail, from courts and from prison. And what we will do unrelentlessly is to work with every individual woman and girl, those 50, over the last 15 days, to keep them out so they will not be brutalised anymore. But it is a war out here on the ground. It is a war because not only to stop the violence of the state, but also to challenge those individuals that are part of that violence of the state and believe that they aren't. If you are engaged in it, if you are employed in it, you are part of the problem. The only way that we can burn it down, dismantle it, is if everybody walks away from the violent structures, from the violence of policing, the violence of prisons, the violence of court, and not enter the doors again. It will collapse in on itself, and then we can rebuild. I'll leave it at there for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tabitha and Debbie, for those powerful words. I'd like to introduce Behrouz Boochani now. So over to you, Behrouz.
Yeah, just unmuted. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm talking with you from in the indigenous land of Maori, Ataura. Actually, so your experience was a different experience, but let me talk about my experience as a refugee, as someone who came to Australia. I came on 2013. So they banished me when I arrived in Australia. They banished me to Manus Island. So we were more than 1,000 people. So I was in that indefinite detention for more than 6 years. And so just I wanted to mention something about that prison system. While I was in Manus Island, I was actually witnessed at how they were building prisons. So, and that time that I was in Manus Island, I was witnessed at how our prison became bigger and bigger. So at the very beginning, it was just 3 prison camps. three separated prison camps, and then they built another one. So we were watching them, that how they were building that prison, and after a while they build another prison out of that prison, and with a dormitory for many guards and for the people who were working with the security companies. So that became bigger and bigger, and after 4 years they built another prison camps, another 3 prison camps in other side of the island. So after 4 years, they transfer us to those prison camps. And in the end, they opened the gates and the island became a prison for us. So that was my experience with the Australian actually system and mentality, and the appetite to build and develop these prison camps. And the interesting thing is that how they actually damage the environment. So if you look at the satellite pictures from Manus Island from 10 years ago and compare it with now, you see that how they destroyed many, actually the tropical jungles. And so that they really damage the environment but no one talk about that, and just people just talk about something else, and people don't see this side of this system, that how this system always has an appetite develop it and expand this prison culture. And but the interesting thing that I think the key point, the key concept in this context, I mean, in the detention, is they keep people in indefinite detention. So time is very important here. They are actually torturing people through time. And we had this question for many years, and it was one of our main questions, that how long we stay here, how long we should stay in this prison camp. And they never answered that, because they needed to torture us. And even on 2014, that this question actually ended up in a riot, because we had this question from them. We did a protest, a peaceful protest for about 2 weeks, and that was our main question, that how long we stay here, how long you are going to keep us here. And after that, they invited us to a meeting, and they said, we don't know. And even Scott Morrison, that time he was the immigration minister, he visited Manus Island, and we asked him that question again. He said, I don't know. So I mean, they need that to torture people. And that is really very difficult, and that you, every day, you expect and you think and you imagine freedom. You expect that they are going to stop this policy. They are going to release you from the detention. And that actually, for me, it took more than 6 years. And I know that many of people, they keep them for 8 years, 9 years, and the court system actually is completely failed here. You know, that thing that you mentioned, that about our problem is with the structure, with the system, not with individual, because we have witnessed since 2013 4 prime ministers in Australia, and now the Home Affairs Minister changed, so someone else took off the office. But I mean, our problem is with the structure, that really they by changing people or individual, still the system exists there, and they develop it. And now that most of the refugees from Manusal and Nauru were transferred to Australia, to America, and some of them other countries, and some of them in Australia, the system still exists, and they actually put the people who they say they are New Zealanders in detention. And I mean, and also they take people from the refugees who already were in the community. So I mean, the system always chased them in the community. So if you do every day you should expect that someone come, the guards come, immigration come and take you and put you in that indefinite detention again. So I mean that even when you are free, you are living in the community, you always feel the system. And I think that is the heart of this system, that they don't say how long you should stay in that prison camp. So it's really, that created a huge problem for, I mean, mental problem and physical problem for many people. And so in Manusal and Nauru, 13 people were killed by this system. And I know that those refugees who already released, they were transferred to America, still they are suffering, many of them, because they are carrying something from the past, from that indefinite detention. So that was something that I had to mention. And another thing I wanted to talk about this policy towards the refugees, that they call it the border protection. So border is another key word here. So I want to talk about my mention about my background as a Kurd, that we Kurdish people, we live in the borders because they divided the Kurdistan into 4 countries. So actually they force us. So all of the Kurdish people, they live in the border. I was born in the border, and I have really, so our people have a different understanding and imagination of border. So border actually is a place that the Kurdish people rely on the border because of, I mean, for economy, they trade, they have a black trade, but actually they are killing people there. So last year, more than 300 Kurdish people who were carrying something, like some of them just carry a TV, for example, to just take it from other side of the border and smuggle it and sell it in other side. So that they call them kulbar. So these kulbars actually are now is a very known and huge problem in that area, that region. So that is something actually that that courts really, always deal with border. For people, for example, in Australia and other countries, they really don't feel and see the border in a way that Kurdish people see it and feel it. And also that border actually is, during the war, that there was a huge war for 8 years in that border. And they put like many mines. So this mine actually, any time that you pass the border or you get close to the border, you should expect that you die, or and now we have lots of people with disability. So I mean, I take this experience with border into the refugee world, that how refugees actually understand and imagine border, because when you pass a border, you become a refugee. So here we have different refugee experience with border, and that is related to the border. Some refugees cannot pass the border, so they call them displaced people. So they become displaced in their own country. Some people pass one border, for example, between Afghanistan and Iran, because they don't have this power to do that. Some people go to Europe. So and some people get in a boat and go to Australia. So I mean, if we compare the refugee experience with border with other citizens, I mean European citizens or Western citizens, there is a different imagination and understanding for people who in Western countries that they are able to fly everywhere anytime they want. So that was something that I had to mention. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm talking to you from Gadigal land, Eora Nation. And just thank you, everyone, for your presentations, for sharing your experiences. I'm going to build on what Behrouz has been talking about, but obviously so much of what I'm going to say relates directly to what Tabitha and Debbie have said, and what Amanda will definitely be talking about as well. So I think working with Behrouz and with other displaced and exiled and incarcerated peoples was important for me in many ways. First of all, it was a way for me to engage with and think a lot more deeply about my own experience of displacement and exile. Obviously, a completely different time and a completely different experience, but it allowed me, working with people in this particular time period, in this particular moment in history, in Australia's migration history, gave me the opportunity to think critically about not just the way borders operate in Australia and how border control works to control people inside the borders, but also about how borders operate all over the world, and how the issue of abolition is about what happens in our own societies in terms of our own moral imagination, but also about transformation on a global scale. What we see happening on the border, and then of course with carceral sites within the border, are deeply connected with racial capitalism, global capitalism. It's about using bodies for making money. It's about making powerful people even more powerful. It's about spreading different kinds of systems of violence and different kind of intersectional forms of discrimination, marginalization, submission right across society. So engaging with people like Behrouz gave me the opportunity to think a lot more deeply about my own past and about the communities that I'm connected with as well. But more importantly, I think, or as important, was the fact that I was able to situate my understanding, or the learning that I'd been going through in relation to settler colonialism in Australia within these contexts as well, within the context of border violence. So when I met Behrouz in particular, even though I'd been working with displaced and exiled and incarcerated people for about 15 years, when I met Behrouz about 6 years ago, when I met Behrouz, I noticed there was something particular about his writing. There were different layers of critique, different kind of multi-dimensional aspects to his work. There were different genres or different tropes being used that I wasn't familiar with, and especially because it was coming from the inside. It was resistance, creative resistance coming from inside the prison. So when I engaged with him, when I started to look deeper at his works and I started to engage in discussion with Behrouz, I noticed that his experience in Iran as a Kurd was so similar to the way settler colonialism operates in Australia. So he already mentioned the way that Kurdistan has been divided up between 4 countries. And the way what he didn't talk about, but what he's explained in other contexts, is the way language was stolen, identity was stolen, history was stolen, opportunities for resistance and self-determination were taken from him. And the reason why Behrouz identified the system in Manus Island, in Manus Prison, as he calls it, as a colonial system, was because he'd already been born in a colonial system back in Iran, in Kurdistan. He was already familiar with what was happening. He saw the way that the Australian authorities were treating the Manusian peoples. And once he started to learn about the history of Manus and the way that it was used as a prison in the 60s for West Papuans, and the more he learned about Australia and the dispossession, displacement, and ongoing suppression of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it was confirmed to him that what was happening in Manus Island, in this prison, in this offshore detention center, was an extension of centuries of colonial violence on the mainland. And let's be clear here, if we want to look at it in a much larger timeline, the kind of colonial violence that goes back to the British Empire and its obsession, its insatiable need for domination, control, and of course oppression. So when I was working with Behrouz, I realized all of these different dimensions and could see it so much in his journalism, but I didn't quite understand it the way that I think he was trying to convey, until I started to engage with his literature and his other forms of art. And here I think what's important is the way that abolitionist strategies require tactics and approaches that deal with the material conditions, that try to dismantle the system in terms of the political economy, in terms of politicians, in terms of policies, in terms of investors, but also that needs to be hand in hand with, I guess, epistemic forms of violence, or epistemic kinds of control. So not just the conditions related to the infrastructure, the policies, the politics, the economy, but also the ideas, the ideology that surrounds it. So looking at the epistemology that's driving it. And this epistemic element spans right across the political spectrum, without thinking differently about the kind of knowledge that's produced by people who are displaced, exiled, and incarcerated, without thinking differently about the identities and what they can contribute to society, what they can teach us about state violence, without changing the kind of way we think about how knowledge is produced. The material conditions, or dealing with the material conditions, can always transform. We've seen in relation to the border how laws are changed randomly and frequently, how everything becomes so fluid. It's hard to control, it's hard to predict, it's hard to plan, because the system has learned how to resist. The system has learned how to avoid accountability. So the epistemic is equally as important. And this is where I saw Behrouz's work really making an important intervention. It was producing a new kind of knowledge. And this began with the creation of a new language, refusing to call the prison site a processing center, calling it a Manus prison, a whole new concept. So something even beyond a prison. You know, it was a new neo-colonial experiment that he was trying to describe with that term, Manus prison, referring to the kinds of processes and activities and programs and plans in place within the prison, referring to it as systematic torture. Not just, you know, when something occurs in the prison, not just as an anomaly, as a mistake, as an oversight, but this is state by design. It's state-sanctioned torture that's taking place here. So the second thing that I think is important alongside the epistemic is the symbolic aesthetic. So the kind of way that displaced and exiled peoples, refugees, are imagined. People seeking asylum are always seen in terms of really common tropes. And again, right across the political spectrum: needy people, supplicants, broken people, people who are fleeing a despotic East to find freedom in the West, thinking about them as somehow exotic or quirky, or just these kind of common tropes that have become so deeply ingrained in the discourse need to be transformed. So it's the symbol of the refugee that needs to be changed. These people can teach us something. When I say us, I mean settlers, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples know exactly what the incarcerated refugees are talking about. So they can teach us settlers something really important about state-sanctioned violence. So here it's the epistemic, it's the symbolic, but also it's the colonial imaginary. So we need to even think a lot more critically about even the frames of reference, or even the intellectual backdrop to the way we engage in discussions, the way we think about incarceration. And this is why I think it was particularly important that Tabitha shared her experience in the university, because the university, seen as not just a location, not just an institution, but as an organ of colonialism, is complicit, is deeply intertwined with these kinds of designs, programs, strategies, and of course, physical carceral sites as well. The other thing that I think is important to mention is how translation played a role in empowering and opening up new possibilities for abolition. So using my own experience of displacement and exile, using my understanding of settler colonialism in Australia, and also my critique of racial capitalism, using that to interpret what Behrouz was trying to present, trying to convey, was important, but also it was essential that I was constantly reflecting on my own privilege, thinking about my own position here as someone who wasn't Kurdish, who isn't Kurdish, and someone who isn't incarcerated. I had to think a lot more deeply, and I had to, of course, change that kind of imaginary that I was conditioned by as well, to see the different kinds of resistance, to see the different kinds of cultural elements that were deeply embedded or layered in Behrouz's thinking and his activism, but also thinking about how people who are displaced and exiled and incarcerated in an Australian context are part of a tradition. They have a history, they have a culture, and they're drawing on this. Even the site, the physical space in the prison embodies histories and of incarceration and dispossession and displacement. So what I was encountering while I was reading his work, while I was trying to translate his work, were all of these different layers. And I could see what I was doing as definitely opening up a new way of seeing and knowing in terms of incarceration in Australia, contributing to a new phase in Australia's history, or a new experiment in Australia's colonial landscape. I'll stop there, but I think one thing that I'll finish off on is how this will open up new possibilities. So it's people in academic institutions, people who have access to resources, who have access to power, who are in decision-making positions. I think it's important to invest in the way that knowledge is produced by people who have lived experience. And in this way, we can then start to influence and impact people, students, intellectuals, artists, and of course then policymakers, in terms of thinking differently about the power and the freedom that is embedded in abolitionist ways of thinking.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me? Yep. I'm on the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose sovereignty predates settler sovereignty and whose responsibilities to country are very much ongoing, especially right now at this time of the climate emergency. So before I begin, I respectfully acknowledge Wurundjeri elders past and present, and I extend this respect given the subject of today's event being critiquing the carceral state and organising abolitionist futures. I'd like to extend my deepest respects and acknowledge the leadership as well as the emotional and intellectual labour of Aboriginal elders past and present, in particular, organisers of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, leaders of the Aboriginal Provisional Government, the leadership of Aboriginal Nation Rebuilding organisers, as well as activists who coordinated the Aboriginal passport and visa ceremonies, in particular, Wiradjuri man Ray Jackson and Gunai Gunditjmara man Robbie Thorpe. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live watching this live stream event. And also when we think about critiquing the carceral state and organising abolitionist futures, it's important to acknowledge that here in Australia, the actual work of abolition is being led by the work of decriminalising and stopping the expansion of prison and police industries on this country has been led by bereaved Aboriginal families and by organisations such as Sisters Inside and the work of Tabitha here. So I'd like to acknowledge in particular the family of John Pat, which led to the establishment of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. I'd like to acknowledge the work of Sisters Inside and other panellists. And I'd like to acknowledge the labour of the Day family who've led the fight to decriminalise public drunkenness in the apartheid state of Victoria, the work of the family of the late Wayne Fella Morrison in working to ban spit hoods and other torture devices in prisons, and of countless others. There's honestly too many people to acknowledge here. But and finally, I just wanted to, before I get into the substance of what I wanted to say today, make a quick note on standpoint. And in particular, I'd like to position myself as the least expert on the panel and to say that the ideas and the issues that I'll be speaking to today have already been put more eloquently and more articulately by others on the panel, as well as by countless Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander intellectuals. In particular, my presentation and all of my work owes a considerable debt to the theoretical insights of Professor Gary Foley, Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson, Professor Martin Nakata, Kevin Gilmert, among many others. And for the points I wanted to make today, I wanted to acknowledge in particular the research of Yamatji woman, Dr. Crystal McKinnon, and whose theoretical insights I'll be drawing on today. In particular, I'm drawing heavily on Dr. McKinnon's article, which is forthcoming in the peer-reviewed journal Biographies, titled In Solidarity, Aboriginal Sovereignty and the Long History of Resistance to Australian Illegal Occupation and Border Control, which is a review of Behrouz Boochani's No Friend But the Mountain. And I just wanted to start with a quote from Dr. McKinnon, who states that, and I quote, "This is what Australia always has been. The brutal torture and violence of Manus Island are part of the same continuum of Australian colonial state violence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and polities. The practices of incarceration and torture on Manus Island that Behrouz Boochani painstakingly documents must be understood as part of the history of colonisation. Australian colonists have implemented some of the most racist border policies in the world, and they are the architects of some of the most racist policies and practices to eliminate Indigenous people from their lands. It is vital to understand detention, incarceration, and other forms of custody as central to colonialism in order for us to better understand these systems, to fight against them, and to build better societies with Indigenous sovereignty as foundation." Given that Tabitha, Deb, Omid and Behrouz have already covered some of the points that I wanted to make, I'm going to just make three very brief points teasing out these theoretical insights. And I want to direct my comments in particular to the complicity of the Australian corporate media, the Australian corporate media and the complicity of Australian universities and Australian academics. So the first point relates to the fact that Australia is a nation that is founded on racist violence, settler colonial violence and genocide. The purpose, as Deb said earlier, of invasion was to establish a penal colony as a way of solving Britain's crime problems. Tabitha made this point also, and that's why the British penal colony of New South Wales was established in the late 18th century. And as I'll get to later, it's my contention that Australia's never really got over this addiction to police and to prison industries, but I'll return to this in just a moment. As I said, the history of policing of borders in this nation has its foundations in genocide and land theft and racist violence. And I say racist violence because it's important for people to realise that the history of policing in this country is very different depending on whether you're a civilian or a settler, or whether you're located outside of the colonial frontier. So within the settler colony, since its very beginning, the history of policing there was the first police were the Sydney Night Watch Patrol and the Sydney Water Police. And they were appointed by Governor Arthur Phillip, who appointed literally 9 of the best behaved convicts. That's the actual words from the archives. So, and who governed the safety and regulation inside the colony. Whereas if you look at the border of the colony, something altogether different in terms of history. Here we see the history of the border police, the mounted police, which has been described by historian Henry Reynolds as one of the most violent institutions in Australian history, as well as the native police. And police, there have been, if you look at the history and I would say ongoing colonial frontier wars in this country, we have seen in this country police involvement in massacres in the 18th and the 19th century, which is fairly well known, but also police involvement in massacres which continued into the 20th century. For example, the Bedford Downs massacre of 1924, the Coniston massacre in 1928, and the Skull Creek massacre of 1975 involving the Western Australian Police. So in going back to my point I wanted to make about complicity, I think it's fair to say that most Australians are not aware of this history of policing and of Australian settler or white Australian public institutions, and that this it's really important that this history is taught and is a core part of the contemporary syllabus for Australian schools, in Australian universities, as well as in police academy training. So that's the first point, that the history of Australian settler institutions is a history of settler colonial and apartheid violence. The second point relates to Australia's current addiction to carceral violence, which continues into the present. So we've seen, even in recent times, record budgets that have been given for corrections and for police, in spite of austerity and defunding of so many essential services. We've seen record budgets time and time again for policing, for corrections, and I should add for prisons offshore. $3.4 million I was reading in The Guardian yesterday for each person in offshore detention. And as I was saying with policing, a $4.4 billion budget for New South Wales Police Force, $3.5 billion announced for the State of Victoria Police Service, as well as an announcement for 1,650 new protective service officers to be employed by VPS. And so this is happening at the same time as globally there's conversations and in fact divestment and defunding of police, seeing police budget cuts in LAP, the Los Angeles Police Department, the New York Police Department, in Portland, Minneapolis, and so many others. And as I said, it's not just policing. We also see this addiction to prison and security industries. So 2 years ago, the state of New South Wales announced the biggest contract that's ever been awarded in Australian history. It awarded a $2.3 billion contract to Serco for the public-private partnership, also known as the Clarence Correctional Centre mega prison, which is a 1,700 bed facility which has been constructed illegally on the sovereign country of Bundjalung and Bangir and Yagal peoples. In addition to this mega prison, we've also seen the expansion of Silverwater Prison in Sydney, the establishment of a new women's prison in Berkshire Park, and proposals for a new jail in Parramatta, as well as proposals for the extension of the Dame Phyllis prison here in the state of Victoria, among so many others. So, that name, Serco, will probably sound familiar to many people in the audience. That's the British company that's renowned for profiteering off government's detention and torture of Aboriginal people and refugees, in addition to holding that contract with the Clarence Correctional Centre mega prison. Serco also has 11 of the 25 contracts with immigration prisons, as Behrouz uses the term, and that is followed by Wilson, the Paladin Group, and G4S, who many of you may remember as the company which killed the Aboriginal elder, Mr. Ward, in 2008, when in horrific circumstances. And I wanted to, again, just draw out that complicity of the Australian media here, because I know that I was working with Deb at the time and Sisters Inside to lobby to that the women's section of this new Clarence Correctional Centre mega prison not be built. At the, there was a huge strategy. It was really hard to get media interest in this particular story. We were knocked back by nearly every Australian corporate media outlet. We were even knocked back by The Conversation, which is meant to be an academic publication, because people were more interested in the time at the national election. And even today, if you look at, I think I saw the most recent article by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and they, were willing to basically copy and paste the line that the Corrections Union and that the mayor had been peddling in terms of more jobs. But this is the level of the rhetoric and spin that we're up against. And, again, bringing this back to the complicity of academia, as Tabitha so eloquently put it, it's important for anyone who talks big game about decolonial theory and so on to actually turn up. And, sadly, these prisons, we've just seen an unprecedented investment in the construction of new prisons and the expansions of prisons. And I can say that it's been very lonely, and academics would do well to direct their attention to things that are happening on the ground. And so finally, I've got 2 minutes left. I just wanted to make one last point, and that's about organising abolitionist futures. I'd like to return just to the points that I made at the outset about the ongoing legacy and the ongoing labour of sovereign Aboriginal organisers doing the work to abolish state carceral violence, whether it's doing the work to oppose the construction of new prisons, doing the work of Sisters Inside and their Defund Her campaign to get people out of prisons, through to the work of families to decriminalise the state so-called crimes, such as the so-called crime of public drunkenness, the so-called crime of the trifecta or hamburger offences of use of offensive language, resist arrest, and abuse of a police officer, the so-called crime of driving while black, the so-called crime of seeking asylum. And I also wanted to acknowledge the resilience of families of sovereign abolitionist organisers. And I just wanted to, if I've got 2 minutes left, just give a quick quote again from the work of Dr. Crystal McKinnon, who I encourage everyone to read this fascinating book review of Behrouz's book. So Dr. McKinnon states, as with the Black Lives Matter rally of 2019, passport ceremonies are actions of solidarity between Indigenous and refugee communities. These ceremonies disrupt settler claims of sovereignty and foster relationships built on mutual understanding that the colonial systems that force refugees and migrants into detention centres are the same ones that have oppressed the many Indigenous nations across what is now known as Australia. These events show enduring indigeneity and how Indigenous people exist, resist, and persist. while many rights movements undermine Indigenous sovereignty through appeals to the nation state, these actions are firmly grounded in decolonial principles of centering Indigenous sovereignty. And I just want to finally make a point that it's important to link up these movements of love and solidarity between and convergent movements across borders, including, and I would like to see this happen particularly at the time of the climate crisis, where and of rising pandemics, which are all, of course, completely unsustainable, and where there is considerable scientific evidence now to show that the relationship between that pandemics will become more frequent if we don't reconsider the relationship between human societies and settler societies and nature. And there's a lot that can be learned from, again, Aboriginal sovereign nations doing the work to care for country at the moment. So it would be good, and there is potential, I think, in the convergence of these social movements, in particular the climate crisis and care for country, and the need to link up movements such as cancel rent, #cancel rent, which has been seeing traction internationally and here locally, as we would say, to pay the rent. That's my comments for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. What a fantastic note to finish on there with that kind of call to follow sovereign Aboriginal campaigns, but also to think in terms of solidarity, across the different struggles that we might engage with. I want to thank Tabitha, Debbie, Behrouz, Omid, and Amanda again for sharing such fierce and powerful words. So many wonderful things to kind of draw on in these rich presentations. To think the link between, or to think the kind of continuity and the foundational racism of the settler state, the violence and ongoing violence of coloniality, and the way it manifests both inside and outside the borders of the nation state. The role of material struggle, of concrete struggle, as well as the role of kind of epistemic and imaginative work in advancing abolitionist visions of a future. So there's so much to kind of go back through, and I really look forward to this recording. Will be available to return to for anyone who wishes to do that. And it's something certainly that I will be doing. We have just a few minutes for questions, and I want to just kind of jump straight into the questions. If you do have questions, please pop them into the chat on YouTube, and we'll get through as many as we can. But we have one to begin with from Selena. So thanks, Selena, for the question. Thank you to all of the speakers. And this question I take to be a kind of a question that deals with interpersonal and domestic violence, and how we might think in abolitionist terms about this. So Selena asks, carceral feminists in so-called Australia are calling for the criminalisation of coercive control at the moment. How do we as abolitionists combat carceral feminism? I wonder if I might throw that to the panel. And I'll switch to the gallery view.
I'll give it a bash.
Thanks, Debbie.
Bad word, I suppose. This has been an ongoing topic, red hot topic, I suppose, in the last few days, considering all the mainstream media around coercive control and certain politicians coming out and demanding the criminalisation of coercive control. We've also seen a task force for women and coercive control and the criminal justice system here in Queensland. And what we are seeing is the same as ever before. As Amanda just said before, this continues to be, carceral feminism continues to be Australia's love affair with the violence of policing and prisons. And, you know, decades ago, when the women's movement were lobbying and advocating to stop violence against women and children, which I was a part of, you know, the only answer anyone could come up with was criminalising you know, anyone that was violent in the context of domestic and family violence. However, the laws are degendered. And so what we've seen is the way that they're enacted is by the police, as we have seen, as I was saying back then, decades ago, this will target Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And it did, because the police, which is a fundamental racist institution and misogynist institution, sexist institution, target Aboriginal women. Where now what we see is this is an offence that one of the top 10 offences for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are in prison in this jurisdiction, and I believe, you know, in many other jurisdictions around this country, and that is where they're actually police come in if there's an incident, a domestic violence order is put on them because she's upset, she's crying, police deem her hysterical, so she's the problem. So they put the order on her, or they may put dual orders on both parties. But if there's another incident, the police come back, then she's breached the domestic violence order. She's contravened it, which now becomes a criminal offence, not a civil matter. Then they put her on bail, and they copy and, you know, the bail conditions or the domestic violence order conditions into the bail order. And then if there's another incident, then she's breached bail, so then she's remanded in custody. And we're seeing this over and over again. We had more recently, once again, Carceral feminists, the state lobbying for a new offence of strangulation. And then what we see now is a number of women I see in prison on remand languishing that are charged now with strangulation. This is going to be nothing different. We're actually going to see many, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women across this country criminalised and imprisoned for coercive control. We must stop relying on the violence of policing and prisons and laws to arrest ourselves out of violence. We need the money that's in be put into the community so that we can address the issues of violence. Police escalate violence. They do not de-escalate. Police come after the fact. They are not our saviours. They do not rescue us. They do not stop violence. And actually for Aboriginal people, they don't even come. So why do we continue to call this? So this has been a red hot debate across Twitter this week, where white women have been saying, when Aboriginal women raise this, to not criminalise coercive control. They said, well, there's other Aboriginal women that are saying it. Maybe you need to talk to them. So they've started this debate. They're lobbying for the debate. They're taking the direction of the debate. They're the ones that are being heard, because the knee-jerk reaction of coercive control is all about pretty white women who are murdered by men. Yes, horrific. But I mean, that's only when we get a response. Aboriginal women are being killed since the day of colonisation. Where is the hysteria about that? We don't see it. You know, the piece that we see in the media this week is about the horrific death of baby Charlie. And what we saw is her mother screaming at the police, wanting the police, desperate for the police to get her baby. What did they do? They arrested her. The baby was gone and the baby was killed. And that is how Aboriginal women are treated in this country. So we cannot rely on laws. The laws target Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. We must hold the line on this.
Can I also add to that this whole argument by carceral feminists smacks of so much privilege to think that calling the police will equal safety for a woman in her home. Yeah.
Can I also add to that? Thank you to the person in the audience who asked the question. It's an important question, and sadly, as Deb and Tabitha have said, it's always interesting and revealing for me to see the way in which the media, the Australian corporate media, but also social media, tends to afford the biggest platform for people that have the most punitive response. And as well, you know, and as Deb said, it's hard to get an equal footing sometimes in these debates. And that's something that's not new, that this goes back to the Bell Huggins debate and Professor Aileen Morton Robinson's book, Talking Up to the White Woman, and the, you know, consistent kind of way that white women dominate these current debates. And you know, and while at the same time overlooking the significant body of literature, including Dr. Marlene Longbottom's work on gender-based violence and family violence, the work of books such as The Feminist War on Crime, you know, significant royal commissions and national inquiries. You know, 11 of the 99 deaths of the first Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody included women who were mislabelled as Aboriginal women who were mislabelled as perpetrators in domestic violence incidences. And we see this today through the death of Ms. Du and countless other individuals. And at the same time, we see the work of JIRA here in the state of Victoria and the Tangentyere Women's Safety Patrol Service, which do provide these services persistently, you know, struggle to get, you know, it's the counter opposite of what I was saying in terms of Australia's love affair and addiction with in investing in prisons and police. As I said, I went through all of those record budgets that have been afforded to police, but also expansions of police powers. And at the same time, services such as JIRA are constantly fighting to receive enough funding just to survive, and the same with other services. And I also have documented the work of community safety and defence initiatives like night patrols in my own doctoral research, an empirical project that went on for a long time, but it is hard to get a word in this debate. I did just want to acknowledge that coercive control, like all forms of gender-based and family violence, are a complex social harm. But there's one issue that I take issue with is the tendency for people to look at, as I said, that always the media's somewhat guilty of this too, to give platforms to the most punitive responses. But there are other ways of regulating social harms. I mean, look at alcohol, for example. Do you want to have the police come and respond to public drunkenness, or do you want to have something, you know, what is the role of centres for rehabilitation? What's the role of social work and other responses to these harms? I would say there's other institutions that are better placed, that are more professional and more apt to respond to complex social harms, and there's better ways of regulating these things. And we need to be turning our mind to the significant empirical research that's out there, in particular the significant work that's been done by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers. In particular, I mentioned the work of Dr. Marlene Longbottom, and there's many others.
Thank you so much. Such a great response, and a very clear kind of call there. Not to that the answer is not to criminalize. The answer is not to turn to these structures. So thank you. I'm conscious, and Behrouz has just had to go, and I'm conscious that we're at time. I wonder if the panel has time for maybe one more question. Fantastic. Before we go into this last question, I'll just say that we will be back on Monday morning with the second part of this program, which will focus on resistant media practices, and we'll take up some of the questions that Amanda and Tabitha and Debbie were just talking about, particularly in terms of who is given a platform to speak and which voices are amplified. And how certain practices of media making and reportage can work against the sort of whiteness of mainstream media and its tendency to amplify punitive responses. And that will be with Alison Whitaker and Robert Bretherton and Joanna Bell. So we'll be back on Monday, 10 a.m. on YouTube as well. So please join us for that. And one last thing before we take this final question is that I'll just, we've popped a bunch of links to various things, writings, ongoing campaigns at the moment into the YouTube chat, and we can share those links with everyone who's registered for today through the Eventbrite. And if you didn't, you've just come to this stream, you can probably find them in the chat, or you can send us an email or get in touch through Twitter, and we can get those to you as well. So just to finish with that, I wanted to ask and maybe invite you to speak just a little bit more about the prison as a site and the prison industrial complex as a sort of expanding set of sites and logics that reach into everyday life. And this is something that was touched on in all of the talks today. We often think, or we might sometimes think of the prison as a static site, as a physical location or a kind of contained architecture that has its own processes and systems. But today we've heard kind of accounts of carceral mentality, the ability of carceral systems to shift and change while remaining committed to a project of removing certain people from society or instilling a sense of and perpetuating a sense of punitive justice that certainly reproduces racism and a foundational racism in the settler colony. So the prison remains this imposing structure, but it also takes the form of camps on Manus Island or hotel rooms in capital cities. And then there is, as Tabitha touched on so eloquently, there is the kind of expansion and encroachment of carceral logics into schools, health systems, bureaucratic processes. There is the temporality of incarceration that continues post-release. And I wonder if you might just talk a little more about this and how we might, specifically how we might approach abolitionist organising when the structures that imprison and contain people are not static ones, but are kind of shifting and taking new forms and finding new forms.
I could just talk very briefly because other people probably got better ideas than me, but I see abolition as a way of living. Look, I think for me, I try and enact abolition principles in my whole life. So whether that's in my parenting, the way I work, how I converse with my family, my communities, with institutions, I see it as about, it's absolutely a way of living for me, because I see abolition as really just loving people beyond who we want them to be. So I think if we all were abolitionists and just loved one another better than we do right now, we wouldn't actually end up needing prisons and things like that. So we always think about abolition as this kind of abolishing project, this tearing down, disestablishing, defunding, burning down the state. Like, yeah, that's that too. But it's actually about building up communities, creating these communities of care, models of radical reciprocity, and just loving each other. So I think it doesn't actually matter how wide-reaching the prison industrial complex is, about how many prisons that we have that exist outside the razor wire. Because actually, if each one of us as individuals and as communities lives these abolition principles, all of those tentacles will no longer have power anymore. We give them power, like we feed them power, we feed them fear, a whole range of things. We give them legitimacy because we've internalized that call to vengeance. So it actually relies on us as individuals and as communities to live these kind of abolition principles. And it always sounds really Pollyanna. People are always like, you know, like, you just say we just need to love each other. But the reality is, why has love become such a radical concept? You know, like why has caring for fellow human beings or accepting people across this border into this country because they're fleeing a really difficult position, why can't we just love those people coming here? Why can't we love the people that exist here and all of those things? Like, it's just become a radical concept. And I really don't understand why that is. And I actually think it's quite as simple as that. We just make it really big and we theorize about it and we talk about it. But actually, it's just about loving each other. I think for me, that's what abolition actually is.
Just very briefly, that was a really fantastic response. And sometimes in the work that I do, I talk about hope and celebration and joy and also pride as political acts, and how maybe artistic or intellectual or community practices and activities can open up spaces for that. And maybe I should be including love amongst that series of ideas. And And just one more thing, I think for me it's really interesting and important in terms of abolition, how the prison industrial complex is connected interdependently with the border industrial complex. And the border industrial complex kind of brings in a whole new range of elements and actors, militarization, different security technologies, things that maybe weren't central to the prison industrial complex have been explored, integrated into the border industrial complex, and then they start to, the two different industries start to share with each other and pass off to each other, making each other stronger and multiplying as well. And I think that's one of the major points in the kind of critiques that I've been engaging in, the actions that I've been engaging in, how this system is built on self-replication and multiplication, reinvigorating each other. So yeah, that's just my comment there.
If I can just tag along and add to that list, just to reiterate everything that Tabitha said about that abolition as a life philosophy and a life practice, and the world's respect to all the work that you do, that Sisters Inside do, and that I've seen your children do in terms of I think and it's something that I try to do as well. Like I'm of Aboriginal descent and settler descent, and I've been living here in Naarm, Melbourne for a little over 2 months, but I'm an uninvited guest here. And at the time of the 30-year anniversary of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, I gave a massive donation to the Dudgewa Foundation, and I support I pay as much rent to these organisations as they do pay rent to the illegal white landlords that I pay rent to. I think it should be the same amount, and I don't I think that's especially true for people that are listening in that are on permanent secure employment. And I think I'd add to what Tabitha said about love and solidarity, and what Omid said. I would add also the virtues of what Alison Whittaker referred to as dignity, that there's pride and dignity in abolitionist philosophy and practice. And I would add that it's also a commitment to truth seeking, that I think it's important for people to reflect on the fact that Aboriginal sovereignty predates settler sovereignty, that there isn't a treaty in this country between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander polities and the state, and that it's important for people to interrogate and ask questions about where on earth the authority for the white settler society comes from, because everyone knows since Mabo that the highest court of that particular jurisdiction has said that the doctrine on which it purports to govern and puts forward its authority they said in the High Court in its own words, is a legal fiction. So it's important for people to live ethically and to live honestly with themselves, and to conduct themselves in this way in all of the work that we do on stolen Aboriginal land.
So for me, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I live, breathe, walk abolition every day of my life, and it's how I do what I do. So, and it's about my connection. It's about my relationships. It's about valuing people over property. It's where hope is a discipline, and love is central to that. And the time must come where we must see another human being as another human being and not less than any of us or any others. And to look at behaviour, if there's behaviour that causes harm or behaviour that causes unsettlements internally or externally, to understand that behaviour is language. It's someone else's language who can't articulate what's happening for them. And so to criminalise that language, that's where we end up with all the prison industrial complex structures and create more harm for those individuals. And all of us, behaviour is language. Yeah.
Thank you so much. They're such rich responses. You know, I think just that a wonderful note to finish on. And what you were saying there, Debbie, sort of reminds me of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's formulation, where life is precious, right? And that is such a it's such a simple phrase, but it's such a powerful one, and such a powerful articulation of this kind of vision that says, you know, what's at the core of this, as you're saying, Tabitha, is this kind of this practice of love, which is you know, a difficult practice in a sense, because, you know, it's about loving difference and really opening ourselves to difference, but it's also a simple practice, I think, as you say. So it's a really wonderful note to end on. And obviously these things, love, hope, dignity, they both are the conditions for coming together, and they are also the things that enable us to keep coming together and keep struggling against these structures that are so imposing and so violent. So I want to thank you all. I think that's probably a wonderful time to and a wonderful note to conclude on. I want to thank Tabitha Lean, Debbie Kilroy, Behrouz Boochani, Omid Tofighiyan, and Amanda Porter for very generously giving your time this morning and sharing your experience and insight. We, as I said at the outset, we learn in thinking and struggling towards abolitionist futures. We learn from the experience of those with lived experience. So we really thank you for taking the time to share those experiences of living incarceration and organising against it. And as I said, we'll be back on Monday for a second panel at 10 a.m. Please join us again. Thanks again to the speakers.